Hi, this is Praios, and today we talk about the top 5 river mistakes. We will have a special guest, Phil Galfond. He is not here in person, but we will again watch a video of him where he's talking about the top 5 river mistakes. I actually tried to think about 5 mistakes myself, and it was very hard to come up with 5. So very interesting what he will tell us about. I think the top river mistakes are that you often will have frequencies that are way off the optimal frequency. So folding too much, calling too much, bluffing too much, bluffing too little, something like that. And also, I think people study river not enough, at least for pot limit Omaha, as there are not many sims, or at least not many build sims where you don't have to run the sims yourself, and so it's hard to study river if you don't put in additional work, which most people don't do. But yeah, let's see what Phil's stance is on this, and let's jump into the video.
All right, Phil, I've got a top 5 topic for you. You don't know what it is. I'll read it to you. We'll see if you can make it into something good.
Yeah.
Top 5 river mistakes.
All right, top 5 river mistakes. This is a good one. I like, well, river's the most important street. Actually, a lot of people disagree and say preflop's the most important. But as long as you're okay at preflop, I think river.
Not sure if river is the most important street, because there are 2 things to consider. You don't get to the river that often, so it cannot be that important because you play way more pre-flop. Every hand is pre-flop. You play way more on the flop and on the turn, and yeah, many hands get decided before the river. But the thing is, on the river, which speaks for his theory, the pot is the biggest, and errors in your decisions will be costly, or will be costing the most on the river. So, moving on.
Is the most important street in poker. So let's go through top 5 river mistakes. Number 1, which is bluffing because you can't win if you check. In order for a bluff to be good, well, the simplest definition is your opponent needs to fold often enough so that your bet is profitable. That's the simplest way to look at it. So looking at it from in a vacuum, decide if your opponent's folding enough and then decide if the bet is good.
Okay. So he's advocating an exploitative approach, if I get it right, and not a GTO one, where there is a ideal frequency. And I think that's good advice against most people, especially in live poker, where people are generally not that familiar with GTO. And yeah, even pros are not playing GTO, not even close to it. So yeah, I think in today's game still it's very wise to play non-GTO, especially on rivers. Situations are not that often, and as already mentioned, yeah, people don't study it enough to be great at it. At least in PLO, not sure what's it like for Holdem, but I guess it's the same. And it's hard to have all the things you need to know in mind and play everything perfectly. I mean, even the best player in the world is probably way off a GTO bot, and I guess even the best player in the world probably would lose at an insane high rate against a GTO bot. But that's just my guess. But it's also backed by things what happened. I mean, there is a bot that played against supposedly very good no-limit Hold'em players, and it beat them over a big sample size for a huge amount. I think it was like 10 BB per 100 or something.
If your opponent's not folding enough, it doesn't matter that you can't win if you check, because you can only lose more if you bet.
I mean, this is... I'm not sure if it's the top river advice. I mean, this could also be like one mistake only where I said frequencies are off. And yeah, he probably has bluffing too much, bluffing too little, something like that.
On average. The other thing, now if we're getting higher level and you're thinking about the way that proper strategy comes together, an optimal play, well, it really depends how often you have a hand that can't win versus how often you have a hand that is good enough to value bet. Because sometimes the hand plays out in such a way that you have a lot of misdraws, you have a lot of air, And if you bluff with all of it, you're going to be way over bluffing because you don't have as many value bets to balance that out. I think a really good example of that is something that you would only see from an amateur player, which is, let's say, button opens, we call in the big blind with 10-8 of spades, and the flop is 9-7-4 rainbow.
I already said that in the past. He's mainly a PLO player, but he's still making all these examples. No Limit Hold'em, maybe because this will get more viewers. But yeah, still, I would like it if he puts in at least some PLO examples.
We check call. The turn is an offsuit king. We check call. The river is a king. And now we lead.
I mean, that's like the most stupid behavior ever, more or less. Because, yeah, in general, people don't lead that much, and not that much changed on this board. It does not make too much sense to lead. And I also think he could have chosen his example better by having the flop having a flush draw too, because in this case it would be way more drawy and he could be bluffing with even more missed draws.
So like, you're not supposed to lead anything there because the button's like value range can all still value bet. So if you have a full house, you want to just check and let your opponent bet. Even if you have trip kings and maybe you can't quite check raise, it's still just a check call. So you just don't have any leads there. So if you start bluffing hands because you can't win if you check, then you're over bluffing because you're only betting bluffs. You're not betting any value bets. So that's kind of the obvious example, but there are a ton of examples like that. Maybe not where you have no value bets, but where your bluffing candidates far outnumber your value bets. You can't bet all of them. So number one, bluffing because you can't win. Number two is calling because you have a pretty good hand. This is probably the most common river mistake, which is...
I mean, that's a mistake not only for the river, but for all streets in general. People don't think in relative hand strength, but in total hand strength. So for No Limit Hold'em, top pair is a very good hand, and they think they cannot fold. I mean, even if the action and the player type you're playing against would dictate a fold, let's say he's very passive and he's raising the river, you should know that you are never good, but if you tell yourself, okay, I got top pair, I can't fold, it's just too good of a hand, then you are not a good poker player and you shouldn't do that.
You get to the river, you have a pretty good hand, but your opponent's representing a better hand, and you call because your hand's pretty good. What you should actually do is decide whether to call or fold based on what your opponent's value range is, what your opponent's bluffing range is, what the ratio of bluffs to value actually is.
Yeah, you should basically look at the pot odds and and how often you think you will be good. And if doing the EV calculation or just, this is in theory, you should do the EV calculation. If he's bluffing often enough, then you can call, and if not, you should fold. So that's again exploitative approach, but yeah.
In your estimation compared to the pot odds that you're getting, and then you factor.
I mean, given the pot odds, there's a certain threshold that needs to be met in order to make a call profitable, and then you have just to think, okay, am I good here 33% of the time? And if not, fold. And if yes, call. And don't get caught only because you have a good hand thinking that you need to call.
In your blocker effects. So sometimes it is the case that you should call with more pretty good hands because a pretty good hand like top pair blocks your opponent from having a lot of value bets, like a better top pair or top and bottom pair, whatever the case may be. But the fact that you have a pretty good hand is not at all a reason to call. There are a lot of situations where, because of factors I talked about in point one, people are going to overbluff or underbluff. And if you can identify spots where they're underbluffing and you can fold your pretty good hand, this is how you make money in poker. If you can identify spots where...
Good point. But that's also true for all other streets, not only the river.
They're overbluffing. You can call with your pretty good hand. You can call with your pretty bad hand too. And this is also...
Yeah, I mean, often it's the case where you just have to determine if he's bluffing enough, because your hand might be good, but it's not good against any of his value bets. It will only be good against his bluffs. And if he only bluffs with no pair hands, then it doesn't matter if you have top pair, bottom pair, or middle pair. You should, you just need to determine if he's bluffing enough, because you will not be good with any of these against his value range, but against his bluffs.
So how you make money in poker. So don't just look at the board and look at your hand. You shrug your shoulders and flick in the call. I guess point 3, which is kind of cheating, don't look at a pretty bad hand and fold because your hand's pretty bad. The exact same thing I just said in point 2, but sometimes...
Yeah, that's also what I just said. Sometimes it doesn't really matter. The total hand strength doesn't matter. Because, if he's bluffing, you are good even with bottom pair, and if he's not bluffing, you never be good even with top pair. Yeah, that's the same thing.
It's a spot where it's a great calling spot because people are over bluffing. And it doesn't matter if your hand is pretty good or pretty bad, as long as it beats their bluffs and they're bluffing enough. So that's kind of the quick point 3. So number 4 is betting because you think you have the best hand. Another common one. So I had this happen once where...
I mean, you should... It's not about thinking that you have the best hand. Your opponent needs to have enough hands to call with. I mean, it doesn't help you at all if you have the best hand most of the time, but your opponent is never gonna call with worse. So then you should not bet, because if you bet, most of the time you just would get a fold. That's not helping your EV at all. And if you get called, you have lost. So that's nothing you want to do. And in this case like this, you want to check. Or maybe size down a lot, because then your opponent might be enticed more to call with hands that you actually beat.
I was playing... this was very early in my career, and I was like exclusively an online player, and I played pretty high stakes online, like 5,100 at this point, no limit. I sat down, I remember I was at the Win in a 25-50 no limit game. And for a long time I was playing, and it seemed like everybody kind of knew what they were doing. Like they talked about poker with poker lingo, and it seemed like they were playing reasonably tight. And I don't know, until I got in this spot where, let's just say it was like Queen 8-5, I check called, 7, bringing 2 hearts, I check called, river, Jack of hearts, and I checked, and my opponent bet. I ended up calling with a bluff.
Can't follow him. They should definitely show the board. They do normally. Not sure what his editor was doing here. Maybe he's lazy.
Catcher, because I thought it doesn't matter. Once I call, my opponent turns over king queen. He's like, I guess this is no good. And I didn't snap call. Like, I didn't beat him into the pot. I just took a while and then called. And he's like, I guess you got this beat. And that's when I realized he didn't actually know what he was doing in poker. Because if you have a good hand and you bet, but when they call, you expect to lose, why did you bet? What was the point of betting? Are you trying to value bet, or are you trying to bluff? He was trying to do neither. He just thought, I think my queen's probably good, so I'll bet.
Yeah, that's actually a good point. Not sure how many people do this. I think probably a lot. And another mistake would also be to bet when you just don't know what to do. When your hand is something in between and you are just like, what should I do now? Let's just bet and figure it out from there.
There are a lot of times in poker where it's extremely likely that your hand is best on the river, but your opponent has so many hands that are just missed draws that need to fold, or the hand is just played out in such a way that they don't need to call many worse hands. You may have the best hand 80% of the time, you may have the best hand 90% of the time, you may have the best hand 60% of the time, and especially if it's on that lower end of the range, that's not enough reason to bet. You need to be ahead of the range that calls you. Yeah. And you need to have more
That's very important. You have to be ahead, not of his total range, but ahead of the range that calls you. That's very important.
Expected value betting than checking, which is a kind of more nuanced conversation about the expected value of check calling or the expected value of checking back, because when you bet, yes, you can get called by worse hands, but you can also get check raised by worse hands and better hands, etc. Your thought process needs to go beyond, I think I have the best hand, so I bet. And that actually, by the way, that carries through to every street. There's so much, okay, I bet flop because I have a pair. Okay, you know what? I think he probably doesn't have me beat. I'm going to bet turn again. But why? When it's like not a clear value bet, not a 3.
Yeah, that's not for for the river. But yeah, that's happening a lot. People just don't know what to do and are like, okay, I don't want this card to hit, and so just make another bet. I'm probably good. Don't want him to get the next card for cheap, but in reality, this often just don't. It doesn't make too much sense, and people are just betting because they don't know what to do otherwise, and they also figure, yeah, okay, my hand is kind of okay-ish, so let's just bet and see what happens.
Street value bet. Anyways, so let's find number 5. All right, let's see. Another river mistake is playing your hand in the exact way that your hand wants to play. Let me explain what I mean by that.
Okay.
Let's say we find ourselves in a river spot where most of our value bets are flushes, but we happen to have a good top pair that we think if we bet small, it is good enough to get value with. This is an oversimplification of the spot, but I don't want to take 10 minutes to lay out a spot. But let's say, you know, the way the hand's played out, we mostly have flushes or bluffs. But actually, we found ourselves in this spot for some reason or another with top pair, top kicker. And we can't, like, we can bet 1.5 times pot with our flushes and our bluffs. But with top pair, top kicker, if we bet 1.5 times pot, it's too thin. We can't do that. But we think we can third pot, top pair, top kicker, and still be ahead of a calling range. A lot of times.
But that sounds very exploitative in a nutshell, because if you bet huge with your bluffs and your value hands, and with the in-between hands like very small, it can get very tricky if opponents recognize this behavior, and you might get check raised and be in a very shitty spot.
It's not worth going for that bet with the small, tiny portion of your range that can do it, because your opponent can read into it. Sometimes it's much better to just stick with your overall strategy of, you know, because of the way I played this hand, my only bet size on this river is 1.5 times pot. And even if this hand is good enough for a smaller bet, it's not good enough for my only bet size.
Yeah, if you want to have 2 bet sizes, you have to make it sort of balanced that your opponent cannot read anything into it.
In this situation, so I'm just going to check. It's important.
And I usually am a fan of simplifying things and having only 1 bet size in many situations, unless your opponent is not recognizing anyways. Because this will, I mean, it's not only making life easier for you, but also, I mean, it's so hard to be balanced. Let's say you want to have 10 different bet sizes on the flop. It's so hard to be balanced with every bet size. And often you will have only mediocre hands or whatever, or very strong hands in a certain bet size, and your opponents might recognize and make very good reads against you. While if you stick to just one size, it could be better. I mean, the solver probably can figure out a way where you can have a lot of bet sizes, but for you as a human, it's becoming very complicated and it's hard to make this work.
To understand your range construction and the strategy that you're using, and not just custom bet size for every hand that you might have. Now, against weaker opponents, kind of doesn't matter. You can do what you want. They're not going to read into it too much. But what happens against good opponents is when they can recognize that the only hand that you would bet for that sizing for value is like a top pair hand, they can value raise perfectly and they can bluff raise a lot. So don't let them make that read. Go ahead and check and let them, you know, potentially like check back like a weak 2 pair, depending on how the hand's played out, or potentially check back a weaker 1 pair that might have bluff raised had you bet small. Just kind of know your range, know what your range wants to do as a whole. And sometimes you have to sacrifice what a couple of individual hands want to do for the betterment of your overall strategy, and actually even for the EV of those specific hands if you're up against a tough opponent.
Game. Okay, that's it. Yeah. Thanks for watching. This was, yeah, a good video to learn what not to do on the river. Yeah, like, subscribe, share, all the good things. And yeah, watch this video next if you want to, yeah. I don't know what video I will put in yet, so can't say what it will be about. Yeah, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.